Two conflicts consumed the colonies beginning in April of 1775, the military conflict with Great Britain and the political conflict happening inside the colonies. The military conflict was savage, pitting the civilian population of the colonies against the powerful troops of the British Empire in a new kind of war, a revolution for liberation against an empire. Simultaneously, colonists set about sewing together an independent nation from an assembly of distinct colonies. They had to hastily fashion agreements on whether to demand independence from Great Britain, how to structure their new nation, and how to deal with questions that the Revolution had raised about slavery, the rights of native peoples, the role of women, and the limits of religious tolerance. Though some Americans had been agitating for revolution for years, most people were generally unprepared for war and the questions such a conflict would raise. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, when the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, delegates agreed to support the war, but they disagreed about its purpose. Some still hoped for reconciliation with Great Britain. Most Americans believed they were simply fighting for a redress of grievances during the first year of war, but they changed their minds when the British recruited Indians, African slaves, and German mercenaries and blocked colonial ports. Total colonial independence became the only option for those fighting the war. It was an argument articulated in Thomas Paine's Common Sense pamphlet, which advocated for a complete break from the British political system entirely. It didn't start that way. They wanted the British to admit fault and change their policies, but after shots were fired, it quickly became the only purpose of the war was total independence. On July 4th of 1776, the Continental Congress approved the powerful Declaration of Independence, and the colonies began to reconstitute themselves as individual states entirely separate from Great Britain. By 1781, most states had written their own constitutions, and the Congress adopted a plan for a union of these new states, the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation gave the new nation very limited powers, and it did not authorize for the collection of taxes. So the new government of the United States of America borrowed money from other nations to fund our war against the British. The fledgling nation also had a tough time recruiting soldiers, so Congress created a Continental Army with a single commander in charge, General George Washington. These new Americans, quote unquote, had military advantages over the better equipped and better trained British military. They were fighting at home, they were more committed to the conflict, and they received support from those who wished to see the British Empire fall. Still, only British miscalculations and the transformation of the war actually gave the colonies a fighting chance at victory. The war can be broken into three distinct phases. Between 1775 and 1776, in the New England phase, radical revolutionaries fought the British and their sympathetic loyalists in and around Boston and into Nova Scotia, Canada, helping establish a unified colonial front. In the Mid-Atlantic, which takes us through 1778, the British tried to divide and conquer the colonists, and they chased General Washington and his army all over the Northeast. Many tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy, who had decided to back the British in the war, fled to Canada after mounting losses against the American revolutionaries. The American victory at Saratoga assured the French of an impending American victory, and France provided formal diplomatic and financial recognition of the new American nation. Shaken, the British Prime Minister offered complete home rule to the Americans if they would quit the war effort and again fall under the British flag. In its final southern phase, which ended in 1781, the British attempted to ally loyalist settlement in the old southern colonies into an insurrection against the northern radicals. They even hoped the slaves would rally to the British cause. The strategy failed. The revolutionaries blended into the civilian population, and loyalist sentiment in the South was weaker than expected. With the military support of the French on land and at sea, General Cornwallis surrendered his 7,000 British troops, while an American band played song "The World Turned Upside Down." Those loyalists I mentioned, those are colonists who favor the British cause. So not all Americans wanted war with England. Many still felt that England was the place, or was the homeland, and we'll see what happens to them after the war. The political fallout in England was significant. The Prime Minister quit, and another one succeeded him. British dignitaries met American diplomats Ben Franklin, John Adams, in France to discuss the terms of peace. Franklin was an adept negotiator and got a preliminary treaty signed quickly. The final treaty ceded the colonies from Canada to North Florida, and the last of the British forces soon shipped out of New York. Up to one-third of the American colonists were loyal to the British during the war. These loyalists, sometimes called Tories, faced harassment in the months after the war's end. At least 100,000 loyalists fled to Canada, creating English-speaking Quebec, and many others simply went back to England. Religions had winners in the war: Protestants, Baptists, Catholics who'd supported the Patriots, and losers too: pacifist Quakers and the Anglican Church in America. The Revolution weakened Native Americans, who had largely backed the British during the war, as colonists had been and would continue to be the principal aggressors in conflict over traditionally Indian lands. The Catholic Vatican, for their part, provided the United States with a bishop after the war ended, formally recognizing the legitimacy of the new democratic nation. American slaves were undoubtedly exposed to the ideology of revolution during the war, though white support for slavery in the South survived the rebirth of liberty on the American continent. In much of the North, by contrast, the combination of revolutionary rhetoric and evangelical Christian fervor helped spread anti-slavery sentiment throughout New England. Abolitionists, as they were called, first attacked the slave trade, then laws that made freeing slaves illegal, then the legality of African slavery itself, state by state across the North. Obvious tensions between the nation's commitment to individual liberty and the widespread use of forced slave labor in the nation's economy became increasingly evident. In a half measure, every state but Georgia and South Carolina came to prohibit the further importation of slaves from abroad. The nation's commitment to the ideals of liberty, too, struck many women as antithetical to their own plight. Free white women possessed no voting rights, no property rights, no ability to initiate a divorce, etc., even as they became important incubators of so-called Republican values to future Americans. Americans certainly agreed that they would institute a Republican form of government in their new country, where their elected representatives would only act with the consent of the people. They would aspire toward an equality of opportunity, though no equality of condition. Their ideological aspirations and experiment in statecraft became a model for other nations who too sought to throw off the chains of empire and begin the hard work of instituting democratic self-government. It's worth mentioning we have one of the oldest constitutions in the world because we're one of the first democratic nations. The most basic decision that states made was to draft original constitutions. Americans believed the vagueness of England's unwritten constitution had been the source of significant corruption. The second decision was that the power of the executive, or the president, had to be severely limited. Yet only one house was often popularly elected, and property requirements still prevented most people from voting, even in New America. Many state constitutions, however, were written by special conventions so that legislators couldn't later abuse the powers that they had granted themselves. Though governors became more powerful over time, they remained popularly elected. That, of course, in stark contrast to British kings who are not elected. In Virginia, the Statute of Religious Liberty, written by Thomas Jefferson, called for a complete separation of church and state. Other states took notice of the move, and the preferential treatment given to certain Christian faiths and denominations upon the founding of the original colonies gradually faded from state government. So we moved from religious and business colonies formed with those specific interests in mind to individual states of a confederated nation focused on common government rather than religious or business ideals. Slavery survived in the Deep South and border states for three reasons. Most whites assumed the inferiority of blacks. Southern whites had incredible sums of money invested in their slaves. And even forward-looking people, including General Washington and Thomas Jefferson, failed to envision a future without slavery. Few whites believed blacks could be integrated into American society as equals, and so the cause of freedom in the aftermath of the War for Liberty and Independence did not extend to the enslaved in the American continent. These new state governments, who relied on increased taxation to pay their war debts, increasingly faced mobs of distressed farmers throughout New England. Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Revolutionary Army, issued a set of demands that included paper money, tax relief, and the abolition of debtors' prison. His rebellion, Shays' Rebellion, failed, but it added urgency to the movement to produce a new national constitution powerful enough to survive ideological and military challenge from within. The Articles of Confederation, which only existed for 8 years, 1781 to 1789, were such an effort. They formally united the colonies as independent sovereign nations, but differences among the colonies became evident early after the Republic's birth. The Articles of Confederation did not provide the authority to regulate trade, draft troops, or levy taxes directly. There was no separate executive branch. 9 states, each holding 1 vote, had to authorize a law, and all 13 state legislatures were required to amend the Articles themselves. The only major success of the Confederation were the ordinances of 1784 and 1785, which divided the western continental territories up, unified the way land was surveyed and sold. They gave territories a clear path toward achieving independent statehood, though the actual progress of achieving statehood was slow, as Native American claims to land led to a series of conflicts with whites. Diplomatic failures with Great Britain and Spain after the war, and the Confederation's inability to pay off its enormous post-war debts to her own soldiers, to other nations, etc., offer an immediate example of the shortcomings of the loose Confederation system in early America. A stronger form of government would be needed to match the ideals and the potential of the new United States.